So this time, what we've got to do, log in, make sure we're on Oregon. Right, so in this lab step we'll create an Amazon S3 access point and an object Lambda access point that will allow you to retrieve and transform data from an S3 bucket. The data that you'll be working with comes in the form of a comma-separated value CSV file. The data below is from the dev-team.csv file that is stored in your pre-configured cloud bucket. The values depicted in this file represent data about a development team. The first row of the CSV file displays column name, username, login email, identifier, first name, last name. Each row that follows represents a separate number of that team. Right, so we need S3. Team data. Open up. So we've got dev team CSV. Click on the access point tab. Amazon S3 access points are network endpoints that are attached to buckets that you can use to perform S3 object operations. In this case, your S3 object Lambda access point will use the access point to retrieve your team data before transforming it. So we need to create an access point. Lab access point. Network origin is the internet. Block public access setting for this. You can leave the default values set for any properties not mentioned. The access point used in this lab will be publicly accessible, however it's a prod environment. It's considered best practice to provide specific permissions to any endpoints that will allow the service API operation. Don't need a policy. Now that you have a way to retrieve the object in your S3 bucket, you will now configure an object Lambda access point to intercept and retrieval operations. Run custom transformations before returning your data. So we want... where is that? So there should be object Lambda access point. If you aren't able to see the menu, yes we were, click on Create Object Lambda. Configure the following properties for your Object Lambda access point. So we need to enter Object Lambda access point. We need to browse S3. Click on that. Choose supporting. S3 APIs. Get objects. We're gonna invoke a Lambda function. Which one are we doing? CSV to JSON. You can leave the default values for any properties not mentioned if you will not be setting a policy on this, instead relying on the blocking of public access that is set by default. Okay, so we can create. Scroll to the bottom of the page, create the access point, click on the lab OLAP. This will bring you to the Object Lambda access point page. Click on properties. From the Object Lambda Access Point Overview section, copy the ARN. Keep it somewhere accessible since you'll be needing it in an upcoming lab step. So just put that here. With your access point created, you'll need to write the accompanying Lambda function code needed to transform and return your S3 object data. In the lab step, you created an S3 bucket, so we can check. So both of those exist. Right, so this step we're going to write down the Lambda code that accompanies the access point. So in this example, the CSV file stored in the bucket needs to be converted to JSON. The Lambda function you'll write in this lab will have this functionality as well as the necessary API call to work with S3. In the management console, search at the top near Lambda. So we want the JSON. Should give us a load of Python. Need to replace the code with this. This Lambda function is invoked by the S3 object Lambda access point that we created in the previous step. The event object is passed into the function. It will contain the context about the specific request being made to your S3 bucket. S3 object Lambda currently only supports the get object request. This function will only require the object being retrieved and the necessary API values to return the response to the originating access point. The following event properties are required and accessed at the top of your Lambda handler. So we have an output root and an output token. These are token parameters used by S3. They match the root and the right get object response API call from the original caller. Since the S3 object Lambda access point is essentially intercepting the original retrieval request, these output parameters are necessary to return the transform data to the correct origin. Then we've got input S3 URL. This is the pre-signed URL that will be used to fetch the original object from your S3 bucket. The input S3 URL is stored in the variable S3_URL, and this is passed into a HTTP request that uses Python's built-in URL library 3 to retrieve the specific object. The CSV object is passed into csv.dictReader to read the data in the shape into a dictionary type to be traversed. The for loop iterates through each row of the CSV file, and values under the identifier column will be set as the keys in the resulting JSON. The resulting data variable is then passed into json.dumps to return a JSON object. Finally, write the get object response API is called, passing in the transformed JSON along with the request root and the request token needed to return the object to the original caller. To save your changes and deploy the updated function, you have to click deploy. There. Right, so now we can test that Lambda access point and the accompanying converter function. To retrieve and transform data from your S3 bucket, you'll utilize the Lambda function pre-configured for the S3 get object operation test. In the Lambda console, click functions. So we need to go back. Functions. Click on retrieve team data. Review the existing index.py. So we've got replace S3 object lambda access. Alright, so that we need on. So this function takes a simple S3 API get object call. Instead of an S3 bucket name passed into the bucket parameter, we pass in the lambda access point on. This will retrieve the S3 object using the newly created access point. We'll transform the dev team CSV file into a JSON and it will return it to the lambda function. So let's paste in our on. Be sure to maintain the single quotes here and then deploy. Cool. And then we can test. Enter test for the event name. And click save. So that's doing it. Cool. And then the resulting execution result, you'll see the following response, which is correct. JSON response displayed was generated from the CSV file stored in the S3 bucket. The original CSV file remains in the original state, and the generated JSON can now be passed along with an application that requires this format. In this lab step, you tested the functionality of your S3 object lambda and the accompanying converter function. You've successfully completed the following. Is that it? Doesn't verify it? Okay, fair enough.